Let's discuss the political situation in KwaZulu-Natal. We're joined now via Skype by political analyst Jamie Mighti. Mr. Mighti, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Perhaps let me get some reaction from you on that latest suspension by the ANC in Mpumalanga, suspending Deputy Convener of the Nhlanzini region, Michael Ngwenya. What does this say about just some of the developments that we are seeing within the ANC?
Well, thank you for having me, and good afternoon to the viewers. I think to respond directly to the question, what we are seeing here is an instance where the ANC is taking strong action to try to make sure that its members are operating within the law and that its members are respecting judicial processes, court processes. So what we saw with Culney House, what we are seeing now is a continuation of that. And this is an attempt to make sure that there is order within the ANC. So this is a reflection, I think, of an ANC that is definitely trying to take a strong stand and not to allow for the escalation and exacerbation of what we are currently witnessing across KZN.
Now, getting into KZN now, a lot of experts, when the violent protests started, if I can call them that, downplayed just how, serious these protests are and saying that they are actually contained in KwaZulu-Natal. But perhaps talk to me about, the escalation of these protests. Could we see something similar starting in other provinces, or is this really a contained matter at the moment?
Well, I think that if we just say it's a contained matter, we may be overly downplaying it because, as we know, ANC supporters who support Jacob Zuma are located in a variety of locations. I think what we saw last week and what we've seen this weekend is that there is a lot of groundswell support for Jacob Zuma, and some of his supporters are willing to go to extremes to make their political point. I think what potentially could be leading to lower levels of protest action at this particular point is the very fact that we are in level 4 of the lockdown due to the current wave, the third wave of the pandemic. So I think that we ought to be a little bit cautious to dismiss this outright. My posture is to think about any risk that exists and take it seriously until you have concrete information that the risk is contained. I think that there are a lot of undercurrents that are currently prevailing, and we may have a situation where the protests could escalate as a result of whatever happens on Monday in the rescission application court at the Constitutional.
What is the political situation or solution to this problem that we are seeing in KZN? I mean, we know that the ANC has called for calm in KwaZulu-Natal, and they've also asked the South African Police Service to do what they can to contain the situation. Earlier, the KZN Premier, Sihlezi Kalala, also saying that the protests that we are seeing in KZN are actually not lawful, and also asking people to protest, peacefully. But we haven't really heard anything coming out from those that actually were speaking on behalf of the former president, Jacob Zuma. In fact, today on our show, on our program, on the channel, we had the Jacob Zuma Foundation not wanting to clearly condemn the situation that we are seeing in KZN at the moment. What does it mean in terms of finding a political solution to the protests that we are seeing in KZN at the moment?
I think a political solution has been put on the table, and as you've said, Premier Sihlezi Kalala has also pointed out that maybe a presidential pardon could be a way of achieving it. I think it would be very difficult right now to achieve a political solution because of, one, the tension that exists between the different leaders, if we're looking at Jacob Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa, and two, also the tension that exists between a political solution and the legal process as it unfolds. Because on the one hand, you have people who are interested in preserving democracy, constitutionalism, and the rule of law, and that process is already underway. So a political solution would then circumvent the current legal system by creating a backdoor and a loophole, which could be potentially hazardous to the democracy because it sets a precedent that takes us in the wrong direction in terms of a rule-based society. Having said that, however, there are societal concerns. And if we continue to have these guerrilla protests, these slash and burn type of protests, there may have to be consideration about what is the economic harm, what is the social harm, is there a real risk of ethno-nationalism resurging, because we are aware of the history of 1990 up until 1994, where ethno-nationalism was one of the problems and drivers of political violence in many different locations. So there may be a nation-building perspective here, where there may have to be difficult conversations held with various stakeholders to say, while we want to preserve constitutionalism and rule of law, what can we do within the ambit of the law to make sure that we make peace and make sure that we can move ahead with the democratic project. But as things stand right now, it looks like there's a stalemate situation, but that may change as a result of the decision that is made by the Constitutional Court in this rescission application, which is to be heard.
Now, talking about the rule of law, let's get into that. There is a hope in many quarters that, that the wheels of justice are finally starting to turn. But there's also a growing sense of fear that those who continue to threaten the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law, as you are saying, are receiving some form of preferential treatment, both from law enforcement authorities as well as the judiciary itself. Help us unpack what you think is fundamentally at play here as it pertains to our leaders or people who hold power.
Yeah, that's a very delicate conversation, and it's an important one, because on the one hand, you want to have a legal system where all are treated equal and all are equal before the law. And that is the principle of the rule of law, that we are all governed by one law. There are no thugs that will overtake the system, and there are no kings who will make laws as and when they see fit. Having said that, of course, we are all aware that the legal system, it's all about how much you have, what lawyers you can retain in order to access the legal system. It's a system that is affected by class dynamics. It's a system that is affected by power dynamics. And right now, what we are facing is the conundrum that exists when you have power and the law meeting and clashing very directly, because obviously the legal interest, the constitutional interest, is to preserve the independence of the judiciary, to uphold constitutionalism, and to uphold the rule of law. And the nation-building priority is to make sure that there can be peace, to minimize ethno-nationalism, to minimize risk of violence. Because if we don't pay due consideration to that side of things, you will win the moral point and the legal point, while violence and economic, consequences reign in provinces. And KZN, as been detailed by many of the reporters, is very important to the national economic cause of the ports and all of the goods that come from KZN. So this is the delicate balancing act, and I think that it's going to require people to look back and say, how did we deal with the challenges we faced around violence in the early 90s? Because there was the establishment of the TRC, and that did deviate somewhat from the natural laws of justice, which look at retribution for victims and offered amnesty in return for people, admitting what they had done. And it may be a time now where we have to critically and creatively think around how do we balance these two competing interests so that we do uphold constitutionalism whilst not creating a security risk and a threat of ethno-nationalism re-emerging into the political fray of the democracy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Jamie Mighti.